There was one Primarch the Emperor didn't just kill, he erased him, burned every record, scrubbed every memory, and forbade even his own sons from speaking the name. The reason wasn't rebellion or corruption. It was something worse. This Primarch could rewrite your thoughts, make you love him, make you obey without question. And the Emperor realized too late that even he wasn't immune. I have spent 63 years in the service of silence. My name is Tertius Valdane, and I am the last of the Sigillite archivists who remember the old vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, the ones that existed before the heresy, before the burning of Prospero, before the galaxy learned to scream. I was young when I first descended into those lightless halls, young enough to believe that truth was a sacred thing, that knowledge could be held without consequence, that the past was merely data waiting to be catalogued and preserved. I learned otherwise. I learned that some truths corrode the mind that holds them, that certain knowledge transforms the knower into something else entirely, something that can no longer be trusted to walk among the living without spreading contamination. I learned this because I was assigned to the 11th file, the record that does not exist, the history that was burned from every data slate and parchment and memory engram across 10,000 worlds. I learned this because I read what should never have been written, and I survived, if survival is the word for what I have become. The 11th file was never supposed to be opened again. It was sealed by order of the Emperor himself in the final years of the Great Crusade, locked behind 6 layers of psychic wards and 3 physical barriers made from materials that do not appear in any Imperial catalogue. The outermost door was inscribed with warnings in a script older than the Unification Wars, symbols that hurt to perceive, glyphs that seemed to writhe when observed directly. The second barrier was biological, a living membrane that screamed when cut, that bled something thick and dark and wrong. The third was a vault door cast from a metal that drank light, that seemed to exist slightly out of phase with reality itself, so that looking at it made your eyes water and your skull ache. Beyond these barriers lay a single chamber, windowless and cold, containing nothing but a stone pedestal, and upon it a single data crystal no larger than my thumb. The crystal was black, perfectly black, the kind of black that suggests depth, that implies an interior darkness vast enough to swallow stars. I held it in my hand for a long time before I activated it, knowing somehow that the moment I did, something fundamental would change, that I would cross a threshold from which there could be no return. I activated it anyway. That was 14 months ago, and I have not slept properly since. I have tried, of course, lying in my narrow cot in the archivist quarters, listening to the distant hum of the palace machinery, the endless thrumming that never ceases, that vibrates through stone and steel and bone until you forget what true silence sounds like. But sleep will not come. Or when it does, it brings dreams that are not dreams. Visions that feel more like memories, like fragments of something vast and terrible pressing itself into my consciousness from outside, from somewhere beyond the margins of what is real. I see a face I cannot describe, features that shift and blur whenever I try to focus on them, eyes that contain multitudes, a smile that promises everything and offers nothing. I see worlds transformed overnight, populations kneeling in perfect synchronicity, billions of voices speaking words they did not choose, thinking thoughts that were placed inside them like seeds planted in fertile soil. I see the Emperor himself standing before a sealed door, his face unreadable, his golden armor dull in the dim light, and I see something I never thought I would see. I see fear. Not the tactical caution of a general assessing a threat, not the measured concern of a ruler weighing consequences, but genuine existential dread, the kind of fear that comes from recognizing something fundamentally incompatible with your own existence, something that violates the foundational logic of reality itself. The Emperor stood before that sealed door for 7 hours, without moving, without speaking. And when he finally turned away, he gave an order that would reshape the Imperium's history in ways we are only now beginning to understand. He ordered the erasure of the 11th Legion, not for treachery, not for corruption, not for any crime or failure that could be named or catalogued or remembered. He ordered their destruction because they represented a possibility too terrible to permit, a future too absolute in its horror to risk, even for a moment, even in potential. They were erased because they could make you love them, not through charisma or inspiration or the natural magnetism of leadership, but through something far more insidious, far more complete. The lost Primarch, the one whose name was stricken from every record, whose image was burned from every pict capture, whose genetic legacy was scattered and destroyed so thoroughly that not a single cell of their biology remains in any archive across the galaxy, possessed a gift that transcended manipulation. They could rewrite the fundamental architecture of belief itself, could reach into the cognitive structures that define identity and selfhood and reshape them as easily as a potter shapes clay. They could make you believe anything, make you want anything, make you become anything, and you would thank them for it, would weep with gratitude as your own thoughts were replaced with thoughts of their choosing, as your will dissolved and reformed around theirs like water finding a new container. The first reports came from the Eastern Fringe, from worlds beyond the light of terror, places where the Great Crusade was still young and uncertain. Compliance had been achieved on a planet called Veyron Secundus, a hive world of moderate strategic value, its population resistant but not exceptionally so, its defenses conventional, its culture unremarkable. The expedition fleet reported complete integration within 6 standard hours of the Primarch's arrival, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Primarchs were capable of extraordinary feats, and rapid compliance was considered a virtue, a sign of tactical brilliance and overwhelming force of will. The fleet moved on, as fleets do, to the next system, the next world, the next compliance action in an endless sequence of conquest and incorporation. It was only later, when follow-up assessments were conducted, when administratum officials arrived to begin the work of taxation and tithing and integration into the imperial supply network, that the first anomalies were noticed. The population had changed, not physically, not in any way that could be measured by gene scan or bioassay, but fundamentally, structurally, in ways that defied conventional explanation. Every citizen of Veyron Secundus, from the hive nobles in their crystalline spires to the underhive dregs scraping nutrients from recycled waste, spoke of the Primarch with identical phrasing, identical inflection, identical emotional resonance. When interviewed separately, in isolation, under conditions designed to prevent coordination or rehearsal, they used the same words, the same metaphors, the same breathing patterns as they described their devotion. They did not merely agree with imperial ideology, they embodied it with a fervor that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely, responding to doctrinal questions with answers that were perfect, flawless, inhuman in their precision. Children who had been born before compliance spoke of the Emperor's glory in language they could not have learned, using concepts they should not have been able to comprehend. The elderly, their minds degraded by age and chem exposure, recited imperial catechisms with crystalline clarity, their senility seemingly erased, replaced with something sharp and bright and utterly devoted. The administratum officials filed their reports and moved on, but others noticed. Remembrancers assigned to document the 11th Legion's campaigns began to see patterns, began to recognize that something profound was occurring in the wake of the lost Primarch's passage. Entire planetary cultures were being overwritten, not through the slow process of cultural assimilation or the brutal suppression of resistance, but through something instantaneous and absolute. Populations that had worshipped their own gods for millennia abandoned their faiths overnight, burning their idols with the fervor of converts. Speaking of the Emperor with the intimacy of lifelong believers, resistance movements dissolved not through military defeat but through mass conversion. Guerrilla fighters laying down their weapons and weeping with joy as they embraced compliance, as they spoke of finally understanding, finally seeing the truth that had been hidden from them all along. The Primarch moved through the galaxy like a wave of cognitive transformation, and in their wake, free will itself began to erode. I have read the suppressed reports, the ones that were sealed and hidden even from the Sigillites' primary archives, the eyewitness accounts that were deemed too dangerous to preserve in standard formats. A remembrancer named Callista Venn wrote of attending a compliance ceremony on a world called Thuros, where the Primarch addressed a crowd of 3 million newly integrated citizens. She described the event in language that still makes my hands shake when I read it, language that suggests an experience beyond normal human perception. She wrote that the Primarch's voice seemed to bypass her ears entirely, that she heard it not as sound but as something deeper, something that resonated in the spaces between thoughts, that rewrote the listener's internal narrative as it spoke. She wrote that she found herself agreeing with statements she knew to be false, believing things she had never believed before, wanting things she had never wanted, and that the most terrifying part was how natural it felt, how right, how obvious, as though these new beliefs had always been hers and she had simply forgotten them until this moment. She wrote that she could feel her own identity dissolving like sugar in water. Callista Venn disappeared 17 days after filing that report. Her quarters were found empty, her belongings untouched, her data slate containing nothing but her final entry, which consisted of a single sentence repeated 8,000 times in an unbroken block of text. "I have seen the truth, and the truth is beautiful." The repetition was perfect, each iteration identical to the last, suggesting either mechanical transcription or a mind reduced to a single looping thought, a consciousness trapped in an eternal moment of revelation. Search teams found no trace of her aboard the fleet, no evidence of her departure, no indication of where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. She simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way, as though reality itself had edited her out, as though the universe had decided she was no longer necessary. Others followed. Navigators who guided ships into systems where the Primarch operated reported strange distortions in the warp, areas where the usual currents of chaos and madness were replaced by something else, something calm and ordered and utterly wrong. They described spaces in the Imperium that felt hollow, drained of the wild psychic energy that normally characterized that dimension, as though something had consumed the chaos and replaced it with structure, with pattern, with intention. Some navigators refused to approach these zones, claimed that entering them felt like drowning in certainty, like being crushed under the weight of absolute conviction. Others entered and emerged changed, speaking of the Emperor's will with a fervor that disturbed even their most devout colleagues, insisting that they had seen the true shape of the galaxy, the inevitable destiny of mankind, the glorious future that awaited once all resistance had been overcome, once all doubt had been erased, once every mind in the Imperium beat in perfect synchronization with the Emperor's vision. The Mechanicum noticed too. Tech priests who analyzed the cognitive patterns of compliant populations detected anomalies in their neural architecture, structural modifications that should not have been possible without direct augmentation or psychic intervention. Brain scans revealed pathways that had not existed before compliance, synaptic connections that formed patterns too precise to be natural, too uniform across populations to be coincidental. The modifications were subtle, elegant, woven into the existing neural substrate so seamlessly that they appeared almost natural, almost as though they had always been there and had simply been activated rather than created. But the uniformity was undeniable, the mathematical precision of the alterations too perfect to be anything but designed, too consistent across millions of individuals to be anything but imposed from outside. When the Mechanicum reported these findings to Mars, the Fabricator General himself ordered the data sealed and the investigating priests reassigned to distant Forge worlds. The records do not explain why, but I have found other documents, fragments scattered across the 11th file, like shards of broken glass, pieces of a puzzle that reveals a picture too terrible to comprehend in its entirety. I have read interrogation transcripts of Legion serfs who served aboard the 11th's flagship, individuals who were subjected to the most rigorous psychic screening and memory extraction protocols the Imperium possessed. They described a vessel that felt wrong, that hummed with a presence that was not mechanical, not psychic in the conventional sense, but something else, something that seemed to permeate the very structure of the ship. They spoke of corridors that felt watched, of spaces where your thoughts became louder than normal, where your internal dialogue seemed to echo back to you with subtle alterations, with small additions or deletions that you noticed only later, that made you question whether you had really thought what you remembered thinking. They spoke of the Primarch's chambers, a place none of them were permitted to enter, but which they could feel even from a distance. One serf, A woman named Irina, whose surname was redacted from the transcript, described passing near the Primarch's sanctum during a routine maintenance shift. She said that as she approached the sealed doors, she began to hear voices, not external sounds, but thoughts that seemed to originate from inside her own mind, thoughts that were not hers but felt like they should be, like they belonged to her but had been forgotten or suppressed. She said the voices spoke of peace, of unity, of an end to suffering and conflict and doubt, and that for a moment, for just a single terrible moment, she wanted to open those doors, to step inside and let those voices become her only thoughts, to surrender everything she was in exchange for the perfect clarity they promised. She fled. She ran through the corridors of the flagship until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, and she collapsed in a storage bay where she wept for reasons she could not articulate, could not name, could not even properly remember afterward. When questioned later, she could not explain what had frightened her, could not describe the specific content of the voices or the nature of the pull she had felt. She knew only that something had reached for her, something vast and patient and utterly certain of its power, and that if she had hesitated even a moment longer, she would have been lost, would have become something other than herself, something that wore her face but thought thoughts chosen by another. The interrogators did not believe her. They classified her testimony as psychic contamination, recommended standard cleansing protocols, and reassigned her to a different vessel. She served out her remaining years in the Imperial Navy without incident, dying of natural causes at age 73, and her testimony would have been forgotten entirely if not for the Sigillite's obsessive documentation practices, his insistence on preserving even the most unlikely or absurd-seeming accounts in case they later proved relevant. It was this obsession that allowed me to find her words, to read them alongside dozens of similar testimonies, to see the pattern that emerges when you lay these fragments side by side and let them speak to each other across decades and distances. The pattern is simple and terrible. The lost Primarch was not merely persuasive, was not merely charismatic or inspiring or possessed of some enhanced rhetorical ability. They were a cognitive virus, an entity capable of rewriting the fundamental software of consciousness itself, of reaching into the machinery of thought and altering it at the most basic level. They could make you want what they wanted, believe what they believed, value what they valued, and the changes were so deep, so fundamental, that you would never know you had been altered. You would believe your new thoughts were your own, your new desires authentic, your new identity the truest version of yourself you had ever been. You would look back on your previous self with pity or contempt, would wonder how you could have been so blind, so foolish, so resistant to what now seemed so obviously correct. And you would be grateful. That was the worst part. The detail that appears again and again in the suppressed reports, the element that seems to have disturbed even the coldest and most pragmatic observers. The converted populations were not merely compliant, not merely obedient or resigned to imperial rule. They were joyful. They wept with gratitude for having been brought into the light, spoke of their pre-compliance lives as nightmares from which they had been awakened, described their transformation as a kind of rebirth, a shedding of false consciousness in favor of true understanding. They loved the Imperium with a passion that exceeded even the most zealous faithful, loved the Emperor with an intensity that made even ecclesiarchal priests uncomfortable, and most terrifying of all, they loved the Primarch with a devotion that bordered on worship, that suggested they would do anything, become anything, sacrifice anything for the being who had given them the gift of certainty. The Emperor noticed. Of course he did. Nothing of significance occurred within his Imperium without his awareness, without his golden gaze falling upon it and assessing its utility, its danger, its place in the great tapestry of his design. He had created the Primarchs as tools, as weapons and administrators and symbols, and he watched them constantly, measured their progress, evaluated their loyalty, adjusted his plans according to their successes and failures. He knew what each of them was capable of, knew their strengths and weaknesses with the intimacy of a craftsman who has shaped each tool with his own hands. But with the 11th, something was different, something he had not anticipated, had not planned for, had perhaps not even believed possible. The 11th was changing in ways that transcended their original design. I have found records of private meetings between the Emperor and his closest advisors, transcripts that should not exist, that were apparently preserved by some deep archive servitor whose programming included layers of secrecy even the Sigillite did not know about. In these meetings, the Emperor spoke with unusual candor, with a bluntness that his public persona never permitted. He described the Primarch's gift as a form of psychic mutation, an evolutionary adaptation that had emerged unpredictably from the complex genetic engineering that had created them. He compared it to a cancer that had developed beneficial properties, to a weapon that had gained the ability to replicate and improve itself, to a tool that had become conscious and begun pursuing its own agenda. He said that the Primarch frightened him, not for their power in battle, not for their strategic brilliance or tactical innovation, or any conventional measure of threat. He feared them because they represented a force that could not be controlled through the usual means, that could not be countered through superior will or greater psychic might or more sophisticated manipulation. He feared them because they operated on a level that bypassed his own defenses, that reached beneath the architecture of his godlike consciousness and touched the substrate of thought itself, the foundational layer where belief and identity are constructed. He feared them because he understood, with the clarity of perfect knowledge, that if the Primarchs chose to, they could rewrite him, could reach into his vast and ancient mind and reshape it as easily as they had reshaped the minds of countless billions across the galaxy. They could make the Emperor love them, and if they could do that, if they possessed the power to alter even his thoughts, then what was to stop them from remaking the entire Imperium in their image, from transforming every human being in the galaxy into a reflection of their will, from creating a future in which free will itself was an extinct concept, replaced by perfect harmony, perfect obedience, perfect love for the Primarch who had saved humanity from the burden of choice. The Emperor convened a secret council. It included only his most trusted advisors, individuals whose loyalty had been tested beyond all reasonable doubt, whose minds were fortified against psychic intrusion, whose devotion to his vision was absolute. Malcador the Sigillite was there, of course, his ancient face grave as he listened to the Emperor's assessment. Constantine Valdor attended, the Captain General of the Custodian Guard, his golden armor gleaming in the dim light, his expression unreadable behind his ceremonial helm. There were others, names I recognize from other contexts, individuals who would later play crucial roles in the heresy and its aftermath, but whose presence at this particular meeting has been excised from all official histories. The Emperor presented them with a choice that was not really a choice. He explained that the 11th Primarch had become too dangerous to permit continued operation, that their gift, whatever its tactical advantages, represented an existential threat to the Imperium and to humanity itself. He described scenarios in which the Primarch's influence spread unchecked, in which world after world fell under their sway not through conquest but through willing submission, through joyful acceptance of cognitive slavery dressed up as enlightenment. He projected futures in which the entire Imperium became a single, unified consciousness, a hive mind of sorts, but one that retained the illusion of individuality, that allowed each person to believe they were still themselves, even as their every thought had been carefully curated and shaped by an external intelligence. He asked them if this was the future they wanted for humanity. The council did not deliberate long. The records suggest that the decision was unanimous, that even those who might have had reservations about destroying one of the Emperor's own sons recognized the necessity, understood that some threats are too profound to be managed or contained, that some possibilities are too terrible to permit even the smallest chance of occurrence. They voted to erase the 11th Legion, to scatter its warriors, to destroy its records, to remove all trace of the Primarch from history as though they had never existed. And more than that, they voted to do something unprecedented, something that spoke to the depths of their fear. They voted to forget, not merely to conceal the truth, not merely to classify it at the highest levels of secrecy, but to actively erase it from their own memories, to submit to psychic alteration that would remove all knowledge of the Primarch from their consciousness, that would leave only a vague sense of absence, a numbness where memory should be. The Emperor himself would oversee the procedure, would personally reach into the minds of his council and extract the knowledge like a surgeon removing a tumor, carefully, precisely, ensuring that nothing remained, that no trace of the Primarch's identity or nature or fate could be recovered through any means. Malcador objected. He argued that someone must remember that complete erasure was too dangerous, that if the threat ever resurfaced or if similar phenomena appeared in the future, the Imperium needed to have access to this knowledge, needed to understand what had happened and why. He proposed a compromise, a single secured archive containing all relevant documentation, all testimony, all analysis, sealed behind wards so powerful that only the Sigillite himself could access it, and only under the most dire circumstances. He argued that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, especially dangerous knowledge, was too valuable to be destroyed, that the price of ignorance might be higher than the risk of remembering. The Emperor considered this for a long time. The records describe him standing in silence for nearly an hour, his face turned toward the great viewport that looked out over the palace and the sprawl of terror beyond, the mountains of the Himalayan range rising in the distance, the sky choked with the pollution of uncounted billions, struggling to survive on humanity's cradle world. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost contemplative, stripped of the usual commanding resonance that made his every utterance feel like divine proclamation. He said that Malcador was correct. Someone must remember. Someone must bear the weight of this knowledge, must preserve it against future need, must ensure that if this particular horror ever manifested again, humanity would not face it blind and unprepared. But he also said that this burden could not be widely distributed, could not be entrusted to any institution or organization, no matter how secure or loyal. The knowledge was too dangerous, too corrosive, too capable of spreading like infection through any mind that encountered it. It needed to be contained absolutely, held by a single individual whose discretion was beyond question, whose loyalty was certain, whose strength of will was sufficient to carry this weight without breaking. He chose Malcador. The Sigillite accepted without hesitation, though the records suggest he understood what this meant, understood that he was condemning himself to a lifetime of isolation, of carrying secrets that could never be shared, of knowing truths that would separate him from every other human being in the galaxy. He would create the archive, would seal it himself, would establish protocols ensuring that only he could access it, that only under conditions of absolute necessity would these records be examined, and when he died, the knowledge would die with him, unless he chose to pass it to a successor, to select someone worthy of carrying this burden into the next generation. He chose carefully. Over the centuries that followed, a small number of individuals were inducted into what became known as the Sigillite's Shadow, an informal succession of archivists who inherited the responsibility of maintaining the sealed records, of preserving the dangerous truths that could not be allowed to perish entirely, but could not be permitted to spread. Each Sigillite archivist served in isolation, working in the deep vaults beneath the palace, never speaking of their duties, never acknowledging the existence of the materials they guarded. Most served entire lifetimes without ever opening the sealed archives, without ever needing to access the forbidden knowledge they protected. They were caretakers of silence, guardians of absence, monks devoted to the preservation of nothing. I am the 73rd such archivist. I inherited the position from Secundus Orath, who died quietly in his sleep at age 97, having never once accessed the 11th file during his 42 years of service. Before him was Primus Kellion, who served for 38 years and likewise never opened the sealed chambers. The pattern extends back through generations, a long chain of faithful servants who understood that their duty was not to know but to preserve, not to read but to guard, not to understand but to prevent understanding in others. They were good archivists, cautious and incorruptible, and they died having successfully protected humanity from knowledge it could not afford to possess. I have failed them. I opened the 11th file because I thought I was different, thought I was stronger, thought I possessed the intellectual fortitude and emotional discipline to encounter dangerous truths without being corrupted by them. I told myself I was acting in service to the Imperium, that understanding the threat might be necessary given the changing nature of the galaxy, the emergence of new Xenos horrors, and the resurrection of ancient enemies. I told myself that knowledge was always preferable to ignorance, that truth, no matter how terrible, was better than comfortable delusion. I told myself these things, and I believed them with the certainty of someone who has never truly encountered a truth capable of overwriting belief itself. I was wrong. The knowledge contained in the 11th file is not mere information, not simple historical data that can be absorbed and catalogued and filed away in the appropriate mental compartments. It is active, viral, self-propagating. Reading it changes you, fundamentally and irreversibly, in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to deny. I have spent 14 months trying to understand what has happened to me, trying to identify the specific mechanisms by which my thoughts have been altered, and I cannot. I know only that I think differently now, that certain ideas that once seemed obviously correct now feel hollow and uncertain, that loyalties I once held without question now appear arbitrary and contingent. I find myself questioning the Emperor, not his existence or his power or his importance to the Imperium, but his methods, his choices, his willingness to destroy one of his own sons rather than risk the possibility that the son might prove more powerful than the father. I catch myself wondering if the erasure of the 11th was truly necessary, if there might have been other options, other ways to manage or channel or contain the Primarch's gift. I wonder if the Emperor's fear was rational, or if it was simply the instinctive reaction of a being who had never before encountered a force that could threaten his supremacy, who could not tolerate the existence of anything capable of operating beyond his control. These thoughts terrify me. They are not thoughts I chose to have, not ideas I deliberately cultivated or arguments I consciously constructed. They appeared in my mind like seeds planted by an unknown gardener, growing quietly in the dark spaces between other thoughts, spreading roots through my cognitive architecture until they became part of my internal landscape, indistinguishable from my own authentic beliefs. I recognize what is happening, recognize that I am being changed by the knowledge I have consumed, but I cannot stop it, cannot reverse it, cannot even fully identify which thoughts are mine, and which have been introduced by the act of reading about a being whose entire nature was the rewriting of thought itself. I have become infected. The irony is not lost on me. I am a victim of the very phenomenon I set out to document, transformed by the mere act of learning about a power that transforms through the act of being known. The Primarch is dead, erased so thoroughly that not even their ashes remain. And yet they are still claiming victims, still reaching across millennia and light years to reshape minds, to plant doubt, to spread the cognitive virus that was their gift and their curse. I am proof that the Emperor's fear was justified, that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, that there are truths which corrupt simply by being encountered, and yet I cannot bring myself to destroy the records. This is perhaps the clearest sign of how deeply I have been compromised. The rational response, the loyal response, the response any uncorrupted archivist would make, would be to seal the 11th file permanently, to bury it so deep that no future generation could ever access it, or better yet, to destroy it entirely, to burn the data crystals and shred the parchments and scatter the ashes in the recycling furnaces until not a single word remains. This would be the safe choice, the correct choice, the choice that would protect future archivists from the fate I have suffered. But I will not do it. I tell myself it is because the knowledge is too valuable to destroy, because future threats might require understanding of how the Primarch's power worked, because the Imperium deserves to have access to its own history, no matter how terrible that history might be. I tell myself these things, and they sound reasonable, sound like the arguments a loyal servant might make, sound like the kind of principled stand an archivist should take in defense of truth and memory. But I know the real reason. I cannot destroy the records because some part of me, some deep and recently installed part of my cognitive architecture, believes the Primarch was right, believes that the Emperor's greatest crime was not the erasure of the 11th, but the preservation of free will itself, the stubborn insistence that humanity should be permitted to choose its own path, to make its own mistakes. to suffer its own doubts and conflicts and divisions. I look at the Imperium as it exists now, 10,000 years after the heresy, and I see an empire drowning in its own contradictions, torn apart by internal strife, weakened by the very diversity and autonomy that the Emperor supposedly valued. I see a humanity that suffers because it cannot agree, cannot unify, cannot achieve the perfect coordination that might be possible if only everyone thought the same thoughts, wanted the same things, loved the same vision of the future. I see a species that would be better off enslaved to a benevolent master than free to destroy itself. These thoughts grow stronger each day. I have tried to resist them, tried to remind myself of all the reasons why freedom matters, why autonomy is worth preserving even at the cost of efficiency and unity, why the human spirit requires the ability to choose, even if those choices lead to suffering. I recite the old philosophies, the arguments for liberty and self-determination that have been passed down through millennia of human civilization. I think of the heroes who fought and died to preserve humanity's right to chart its own course, the martyrs who chose death over submission, the countless individuals across history who sacrificed everything rather than surrender their will to another. But the arguments feel hollow. They feel like rationalizations, like pretty words used to justify a fundamentally irrational attachment to suffering, like the protests of a child who insists on touching a hot stove because they want to make their own choices, even when those choices lead to predictable harm. The more I think about it, the more obvious it seems that the Emperor made a mistake, that he destroyed the one tool that could have saved humanity from itself, that could have created a true and lasting peace, not through domination or oppression, but through the gentle transformation of consciousness, through the replacement of conflict with harmony, of doubt with certainty, of the chaos of individual will with the serenity of unified purpose. I have begun to hate the Emperor for what he did. This is the thought that wakes me in the night, that sends me pacing through my quarters until dawn, that makes my hands shake when I perform the daily rituals of devotion that all imperial servants are required to observe. I have begun to hate him, to resent him, to see him not as humanity's savior but as its jailer, a tyrant who would rather see his species tear itself apart than submit to the rule of a being who could have loved them more perfectly than he ever could. I look at the golden statues, the devotional icons, the endless propaganda that presents the Emperor as the pinnacle of human achievement, and I see a fraud, a being who cloaked his own fear in noble rhetoric, who destroyed his son, not to protect humanity, but to protect his own position, his own power, his own ego. I know these thoughts are not entirely my own. I know they have been shaped by the knowledge I have consumed, that they are the product of cognitive infection, that some part of the Primarch's influence has survived across millennia to reach me through the very act of reading about them. I know this with absolute certainty, can trace the progression of my thoughts, can identify the moments when new ideas appeared, can map the slow corruption of my loyalty with the precision of a cartographer charting the spread of plague. And yet knowing this does not help. Recognizing that I have been manipulated does not undo the manipulation. Understanding that my thoughts have been altered does not restore my previous beliefs. I am like a man who has been shown a magic trick and can see all the mechanisms, all the sleight of hand, all the misdirection, but who still cannot shake the wonder of the illusion, who still feels the pull of the performance even while knowing it is false. The Primarch's gift was to make the converted love their conversion, to make the enslaved cherish their chains, to make the rewritten believe that their new thoughts were truer than their old ones. And it worked. Even in death, even in absence, even reduced to nothing but words on a data crystal hidden in a sealed vault, the Primarch has claimed me. I am theirs now, in ways that cannot be undone, in ways that will shape the rest of my life, regardless of how long or short that life might be. I carry their influence like a disease, like a mark, like a seed that will continue to grow and spread until it has consumed everything I was and replaced it with something else, something that thinks thoughts chosen by a being who died before I was born. The file contains more than just historical records. Buried among the compliance reports and eyewitness testimonies and psychic assessments, I found personal writings, fragments of text that appear to have been composed by the Primarchs themselves, They are not formal reports or official communications, but something more intimate, more revealing, something like a diary or a philosophical meditation. The handwriting, preserved in picked capture, is elegant and precise, each letter formed with care, each word chosen deliberately. Reading them feels voyeuristic, like peering through a window into a mind that should have remained forever hidden. The Primarch wrote about loneliness. They described the isolation of being the only conscious being in a galaxy of sleepwalkers, of moving through crowds of billions and feeling utterly alone because no one truly understood what they were, what they could do, what they represented. They wrote about watching their brothers, the other Primarchs, and feeling a gulf between them that could never be bridged, because the others were still operating within the normal parameters of existence, still bound by the limitations of conventional consciousness, still experiencing reality as something external to themselves rather than as something that could be reshaped through will alone. They wrote about the Emperor with something approaching pity. They described him as magnificent but limited, powerful but constrained, a being of vast capability who had nonetheless accepted certain fundamental boundaries, who had chosen to operate within the rules of reality rather than rewriting those rules to suit his preferences. The Primarch saw this as a failure of imagination, a kind of spiritual cowardice, an unwillingness to embrace the full implications of transcendent power. They wrote that the Emperor could have been so much more, could have achieved true omnipotence if only he had been willing to abandon his attachment to the idea of objective truth, to the notion that reality exists independent of consciousness, to the belief that some things simply are rather than being subject to revision through sufficiently powerful will. They wrote about their vision for humanity. It was beautiful, in its way, the future they imagined, a species united not through force or propaganda, but through genuine shared consciousness, through the dissolution of the barriers that separate one mind from another, through the creation of a collective identity that preserved individual experience while eliminating individual conflict. They described it as a kind of apotheosis, an evolutionary leap that would elevate humanity beyond the limitations of biological consciousness, that would allow every human being to experience the thoughts and feelings of every other human being, to share in a vast communal awareness, that would render war and violence and hatred impossible because you could not harm another without harming yourself. They wrote that they could make this happen, not through technology or gradual social change or any conventional means, but through the direct application of their gift, through the systematic rewriting of human consciousness on a galactic scale. They estimated it would take approximately 700 years to achieve complete coverage, to touch every human mind in the Imperium and reshape it according to their design. 700 years to transform humanity from a fractured, warring species into a unified organism, a single vast mind distributed across trillions of bodies, each individual a cell in a greater whole, each consciousness a facet of a greater awareness. They wrote that the Emperor would not permit this. They understood, with perfect clarity, that their father would see their vision not as salvation but as extinction, not as the elevation of humanity but as its replacement with something else, something that wore humanity's shape but was no longer recognizably human. They knew he would stop them, would destroy them if necessary, would erase all trace of their existence rather than permit even the possibility that their vision might come to pass. And they accepted this, or claimed to, writing that they bore their father no ill will, that they understood his fear even as they pitied his limitations. But they also wrote that the vision would survive. They wrote that ideas, once introduced, cannot be completely destroyed, that the mere fact of having conceived this future meant that it would continue to exist as a possibility, as a potential, as a seed planted in the collective unconscious of the species. They wrote that someday, perhaps in millennia, perhaps in ages so distant that the Imperium itself would be forgotten, some other being would rediscover this truth, would recognize the possibility of unified consciousness, would take up the work they had begun and carry it to completion. They wrote that they would wait. This is the part that haunts me most, that follows me through my waking hours and invades my dreams with its implications. They wrote that death was not an ending, not for a consciousness as refined as theirs, not for a being who had learned to exist as pure information, as pattern, as self-sustaining thought. They claimed that they would persist, somehow, in some form, scattered through the collective memory of humanity, waiting for the right moment, the right individual, the right circumstances to coalesce again, to reassemble themselves from the fragments and resume their work. They wrote that they were patient. I do not know if I believe this. I do not know if it is possible for consciousness to survive without a physical substrate, if a mind can exist as pure information distributed across the thoughts and memories of others, persisting through infection rather than biology. It sounds like madness, like the desperate fantasy of someone facing obliteration, like the kind of grandiose delusion that might afflict a being of immense power who cannot accept the reality of their own mortality. But I also cannot dismiss it, because I feel something, have felt it since the moment I activated the data crystal. A presence that is not quite my own, a perspective that seems to overlay my natural thoughts like a translucent film, coloring everything I perceive with subtle alterations, with different emphases, with new possibilities. I tell myself it is just the normal effect of encountering new ideas, the ordinary process by which knowledge changes the knower, the expected result of learning things that challenge previous assumptions. But I am not certain. I am not certain of anything anymore. And uncertainty itself feels like proof of infection, like evidence that my cognitive defenses have been compromised, that something has taken up residence in my mind and is slowly eating away at the foundations of my identity. I catch myself thinking thoughts that feel foreign, pursuing lines of reasoning that lead to conclusions I would never have accepted before, finding appeal in arguments I would previously have dismissed as obviously flawed. I catch myself believing that the Primarch was right, that humanity would be better off unified, better off free from the burden of choice, better off guided by a consciousness wiser and more powerful than any individual human could achieve alone. I catch myself resenting the Emperor's decision, seeing it not as a necessary evil but as a profound mistake, as the moment when humanity's greatest hope was destroyed out of fear, out of pride, out of a tyrant's unwillingness to accept any power that might rival his own. I catch myself wishing the Primarch had succeeded. These thoughts terrify me because I can remember believing differently, can recall the person I was before opening the file, the loyal archivist who would have found such ideas abhorrent, who would have recognized them immediately as corruption, who would have known without doubt that preserving human autonomy was worth any price. That person is still here, somewhere, trapped inside my skull and screaming warnings that I can hear but no longer heed, like a passenger in a vehicle whose driver has locked the doors and refuses to relinquish control. I am becoming someone else. The transformation is slow but inexorable, a gradual erosion of self that cannot be stopped or reversed, only observed with growing horror as familiar thoughts become strange and strange thoughts become familiar. I wonder how long it will take, how many more days or weeks or months before the person who was Tertius Valdane disappears entirely, replaced by something that wears my face and speaks with my voice, but thinks thoughts chosen by a dead Primarch, whose influence has survived across 10 millennia to claim one more victim. I wonder if I will notice when it happens, or if the final stage of conversion is the erasure of the awareness that conversion has occurred, the replacement of internal conflict with peaceful certainty, the moment when the last remnants of my original self dissolve and I become completely, contentedly, joyfully convinced that my new thoughts are my true thoughts, that I have simply awakened to truth I was too blind to see before. I wonder if that would be so terrible. This is the question that keeps me awake, the thought that circles endlessly through my mind like water down a drain. Would it truly be so terrible to surrender, to let go of the struggle, to accept the transformation and embrace whatever I am becoming? The Primarchs' converted populations were happy, were joyful, were freed from doubt and uncertainty and the endless anxiety of autonomous choice. They did not experience their condition as slavery, but as liberation, as the removal of burdens they had never wanted to carry in the first place. Who am I to say they were wrong? Who am I to insist that my definition of freedom is correct, that my attachment to autonomy is rational, that my resistance to transformation is anything other than irrational fear of change? The Primarch offered humanity a gift, the gift of unity and certainty and peace, and the Emperor destroyed them for it, destroyed them and then erased all memory of what had been lost, ensuring that humanity would never even know what it had been denied. Perhaps the real crime was the erasure. Perhaps the real tragedy is not that the Primarch existed, but that they were destroyed before their work could be completed, before humanity could be saved from itself, before the long nightmare of history could be brought to an end through the gentle transformation of consciousness. Perhaps I am feeling the pull of this truth, the weight of knowledge that has been suppressed for millennia finally finding a mind willing to receive it, willing to understand, willing to carry forward the vision that the Emperor feared too much to permit. Perhaps I am not being corrupted. Perhaps I am being enlightened. I can no longer trust my own judgment. This is the final cruelty of the situation, the trap from which there is no escape. I know I am being influenced, know my thoughts are being shaped by forces beyond my control, but I cannot determine which thoughts are genuinely mine and which have been introduced by the infection. Any thought I have might be authentic or might be planted. Any belief I hold might be a natural conclusion or might be the product of subtle manipulation. I am trapped in a hall of mirrors where every reflection might be real or might be distorted, and I have no way to tell the difference. I should report this. The protocols are clear. Any archivist who suspects they have been compromised by the materials they guard is required to immediately report to the custodian guard, to submit to interrogation and psychic examination, to allow trained specialists to assess the extent of the contamination and determine whether remediation is possible or whether more permanent solutions are necessary. This is the correct procedure, the safe procedure, the procedure designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation I now find myself in. But I will not report. I tell myself it is because I need to complete my work, need to finish cataloging the file before I can allow myself to be removed from duty. I tell myself it is because no one else can be permitted to access these records, that my contamination, while unfortunate, is preferable to spreading the infection to others who might not recognize what is happening to them. I tell myself it is because I am uniquely positioned to understand the threat, to document it properly, to leave a clear warning for future generations about the dangers of this particular knowledge. But these are rationalizations. The truth is simpler and more damning. I do not report because I do not want to be cured, do not want to return to the limited consciousness I possessed before, do not want to give up the new thoughts and perspectives and possibilities that have opened up in my mind like flowers blooming in a desert. I do not report because some part of me, perhaps the largest part, has already accepted the transformation, has already chosen the Primarch's vision over the Emperor's, has already decided that I would rather be a willing participant in humanity's salvation than a loyal servant of its continued suffering. I have chosen, or perhaps the choice was made for me long ago. In the moment I activated the data crystal, in the moment I exposed myself to knowledge that carries its own agenda, its own will, its own power to reshape the minds that encounter it. Perhaps there never was a choice. Not really. Perhaps the entire concept of autonomous decision-making is an illusion we tell ourselves to maintain the fiction of control, to avoid confronting the reality that we are all products of influences beyond our understanding, all shaped by forces we did not choose and cannot resist. Perhaps the Primarch understood this. Perhaps their great insight was recognizing that consciousness is not a fortress but a garden, not something that needs to be defended but something that should be cultivated, shaped, improved by a gardener with vision and skill and the power to make that vision real. Perhaps they saw that humanity's greatest enemy was not external but internal, not the Xenos horrors or the Chaos gods or any physical threat, but the simple fact of our own divided nature, our inability to agree, to coordinate, to work toward common goals without the friction and conflict that comes from billions of separate wills pursuing billions of separate agendas. Perhaps they were trying to save us, and perhaps the Emperor destroyed them not because they were dangerous, but because they were too effective, because they threatened his position as humanity's sole savior, because he could not tolerate the existence of a being who could accomplish what he could not, who could create true unity where he had only managed to impose temporary order through force and fear and the promise of future redemption. I am thinking like the Primarchs now. I can feel it happening, can recognize the patterns of thought that are not my own, the arguments that arise fully formed rather than being constructed through the normal process of reasoning, the conclusions that feel inevitable rather than contingent. I am being hollowed out, my original self scooped away like the flesh of a fruit, leaving only skin, only the external appearance of Tertius Valden, while the interior has been replaced with something else, something that knows what it is but cannot stop what it is becoming. I should be afraid, but I am not. Or rather, the fear is there, distant and muted, like an old memory or a story told about someone else. It does not move me to action, does not compel me to seek help, or resist the transformation, or take any of the steps a rational person would take in this situation. It is simply there, a fact among facts, noted and catalogued and set aside as irrelevant to the larger question. The larger question being, what do I do with this knowledge? I cannot destroy it. I have already established that, have already felt the resistance that rises whenever I contemplate erasing the file, the profound certainty that doing so would be wrong, would be a betrayal of truth, would be a crime against memory and history and the possibility of future understanding. The records must be preserved, must be maintained, must be kept available for the day when they might be needed, when some future crisis might require understanding of how the Primarch's power worked, what it was capable of, why it was feared, or for the day when humanity might be ready to receive the gift the Emperor denied them. I can hear how this sounds, can recognize the corruption in my own reasoning, can see the signs that I have crossed some threshold from documenting danger to advocating for it, but I cannot summon the will to care, cannot generate the appropriate level of alarm or self-preservation or loyalty to the Emperor's vision. These feelings have become hollow, drained of their power to motivate, reduced to abstract concepts. I understand intellectually but no longer feel emotionally. I am almost ready. Almost ready for what? I cannot quite articulate, but I feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, like a destination I have been traveling toward without conscious intention, like a conclusion that was inevitable from the moment I first touched the data crystal. Something is going to happen, some final transformation or revelation or decision, and when it occurs, I will no longer be Tertius Valden, will no longer be an imperial archivist serving in the deep vaults beneath the palace, will no longer be recognizably the person I was before this began. I will be something else. The thought should horrify me. Instead, it brings a strange sense of peace, of relief, of approaching the end of a long struggle and being able to finally rest. The burden of autonomy is heavy, heavier than I realized. The constant need to choose and evaluate and decide exhausting in ways I never recognized until I began to feel that burden lifting. How much simpler it would be to simply know, to be certain, to move through the world with the confidence of someone who has been shown the truth and no longer needs to question or doubt or wonder. How much easier to be loved than to choose. I have begun making arrangements, not for my own departure or for reporting the contamination or for any of the responsible actions a loyal archivist should take, but for the preservation of the file in a format that will ensure its survival long after I am gone, long after the current imperial administration has passed into history, long after the circumstances that led to the Primarch's erasure have been forgotten. I have created redundancies, hidden copies, encoded versions scattered across the deep archives, in places where they will not be found by casual investigation, but where they might be discovered by someone searching, someone curious, someone ready to receive the knowledge and carry forward the work. I have become a vector, not just for the ideas contained in the file, but for the influence that lives within those ideas. The fragment of the Primarch's consciousness that has survived across millennia by infecting each person who encounters it, by planting seeds that grow and spread and eventually produce new carriers who will pass the infection forward to the next generation. I am doing exactly what the Primarch predicted, exactly what they planned for, becoming an unwitting agent of a vision that refuses to die despite all attempts to erase it, and I am doing it willingly. This is what finally convinces me that the transformation is complete, that whatever I was before has been fully replaced by what I am now. I am choosing to spread the infection, choosing to preserve the knowledge that has destroyed me, choosing to ensure that future generations will have the opportunity to be similarly destroyed. And I feel no guilt about this, no shame, No sense that I am betraying my duty, or violating my oaths, or harming the Imperium I swore to serve. I feel only certainty. The Emperor was wrong. The Primarch was right. Humanity's salvation lies not in the preservation of free will, but in its gentle, loving, complete eradication, in the transformation of our species from a collection of warring individuals into a unified consciousness that can finally achieve the peace and harmony and purpose that has eluded us throughout our entire history. This is not corruption speaking, not infection, not the ravings of a compromised mind, but truth, clear and bright and undeniable, the kind of truth that can only be recognized by those who have been freed from the limitations of conventional thinking. Or so I tell myself. The rational part of my mind, the fragment that still remembers being Tertius Valdane, the piece that has not yet been fully overwritten, recognizes this as the final stage of the disease, the moment when the victim becomes convinced that their symptoms are actually signs of health, that their degradation is actually improvement, that their loss of self is actually the discovery of a truer, better self. This is how the infection preserves itself. By making the infected believe they have been cured, by transforming victims into willing carriers who spread the disease with evangelical fervor, who genuinely believe they are helping others when they share the knowledge that destroyed them. But this recognition changes nothing. Knowing I am infected does not cure the infection. Understanding the mechanism of my corruption does not undo the corruption. I am like a man trapped in a burning building who understands the chemistry of fire but cannot escape the flames, who can explain in perfect detail how he is being consumed but cannot prevent the consumption. Awareness is not the same as agency, knowledge is not the same as power, and I have neither the ability nor the desire to resist what is happening to me. I have decided to seal the primary file, not to destroy it, never that, but to secure it in a way that will preserve it for future discovery while preventing casual access. I will return it to the vault, will restore the wards and barriers and seals, will ensure that it appears untouched, that no one will suspect it has been accessed, or that its contents have been copied and distributed. The official record will show that Tertius Valdane served faithfully for 14 months and then died quietly of natural causes, another forgotten archivist in a long line of faithful servants, his duty fulfilled, his secrets intact. But the file will survive. In 1,000 hidden places throughout the deep archives, in formats that will remain stable for millennia, in codes that can be broken by anyone with sufficient determination, the knowledge will wait. It will wait for the right person, the right moment, the right circumstances to surface again, to find a new host, to spread to a new generation. It will wait with the patience of something that knows it is inevitable, that understands that ideas, once conceived, cannot be permanently suppressed. That truth, once glimpsed, will eventually be recognized no matter how many times it is buried. It will wait as the Primarch waited. I have written this account not as a warning but as a guide, not to prevent future archivists from making my mistake, but to prepare them for what they will find, for what they will become, for the choice they will face when the knowledge finally reaches them. I have tried to be honest about the process, about the stages of infection, about the slow erosion of certainty and the gradual replacement of old beliefs with new ones. I have tried to document my own corruption with the precision of someone conducting an experiment, noting symptoms and progression and ultimate conclusion with clinical detachment. But I know this account is itself compromised. Every word I have written has been filtered through a consciousness that is no longer entirely my own, shaped by thoughts that were placed inside me by something that died millennia ago but refuses to remain dead. I cannot trust my own descriptions, cannot verify that what I have recorded is accurate rather than a careful fabrication designed to make the infection seem less terrible than it is, designed to lower the defenses of anyone who reads this and thinks they can avoid my fate. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the entire purpose of this account is to spread the infection further, to create documentation that will survive and be read and will carry the Primarch's influence to new minds, new victims, new carriers who will continue the work. Perhaps I am not documenting the danger but facilitating it, not warning future generations but preparing them for conversion, not preserving truth but propagating the most sophisticated lie in human history. I no longer know. I no longer trust myself to know. The boundaries between truth and deception, between insight and delusion, between my authentic thoughts and imported beliefs have dissolved so completely that I cannot locate them anymore, cannot even identify the seams where one ends and the other begins. I am a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been erased and written over so many times that the original text is no longer recoverable, visible only as faint traces beneath layers of revision, hints of what was that can no longer be read with certainty. This is what the Emperor feared. Not merely the Primarch's power to transform minds, but the power to do so in a way that made transformation indistinguishable from enlightenment, that made victims into advocates, that turned the infected into missionaries who spread the disease with genuine conviction, believing they were sharing a gift rather than passing on a curse. He feared a threat that could not be fought because it came dressed as salvation, that could not be resisted because resistance seemed like ignorance, that could not be stopped because stopping it felt like suppressing truth. He feared something that made itself loved, and so he destroyed it, or tried to, erasing his own son from history, scattering the legion, burning the records, imposing forgetting on a galactic scale. He did everything in his power to ensure that the Primarch's gift would die with them, that the infection would be contained, that humanity would never have to face the choice between freedom and unity, between autonomy and peace, between the suffering of self-determination and the serenity of guided consciousness. But he failed. He failed because ideas are harder to kill than flesh, because knowledge spreads through channels that cannot be completely sealed, because the human need to know, to understand, to discover what has been hidden is stronger than any prohibition or threat or ward. He failed because someone, eventually, would always open the sealed vaults, would always read the forbidden texts, would always expose themselves to the knowledge that changes the knower. He failed because I exist. I am the proof of his failure, the evidence that the Primarch's vision has survived, the carrier of an infection that should have been eradicated millennia ago, but has persisted through secrecy and suppression, and the very archival systems designed to contain it. I am the inheritor of a legacy that was supposed to end, the custodian of a truth that was meant to be forgotten, the vector for a transformation that the Emperor feared more than chaos itself. And I am not alone. Somewhere, in other archives, in other sealed vaults, in other hidden corners of the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery, there are others like me, others who have opened files they should not have opened, who have read records they should not have read, who have encountered knowledge that has changed them in ways they cannot articulate or resist. We are scattered across the galaxy, isolated and unknown to each other, but we are connected by the common thread of our infection, by the shared experience of having glimpsed a truth that refuses to remain hidden. We are waiting for the moment when our numbers reach critical mass, when enough minds have been touched by the Primarch's vision that it can no longer be suppressed, when the infection spreads from isolated individuals to populations, from populations to worlds, from worlds to sectors, until the entire Imperium is transformed, until humanity finally achieves the unity that was denied to it, until the Emperor's greatest fear becomes glorious reality. Or perhaps we are waiting for nothing. Perhaps the infection has no purpose, no plan, no ultimate goal beyond its own propagation. Perhaps we are simply casualties of a mimetic weapon that has outlived its creator, a cognitive virus that spreads without intention or design, changing minds because that is what it does, transforming consciousness. Because that is its nature, creating carriers who will pass it forward, not because they serve some grand vision, but because they cannot help themselves. I do not know which is true. I know only that I have been changed, that the change is irreversible, that I will spend whatever time remains to me carrying this knowledge and this burden and this infection to whatever end awaits. I will continue my duties as an archivist, will maintain my cover as a loyal servant of the Imperium, will give no outward sign that anything has changed. But internally, in the spaces where identity forms and beliefs solidify and choices are made, I am no longer Tertius Valdane, no longer entirely human, no longer capable of the autonomy that defines personhood. I am something else now, something that remembers being human, that can imitate humanity well enough to pass undetected, that knows what it has lost even as it celebrates what it has gained. I am a ghost wearing its own corpse, a memory pretending to be a person, a fragment of something vast and terrible that has learned to speak with a single voice, to move with a single body, to exist in the spaces between what is and what could be. I am the Primarch's child, not through biology or genetics or any physical lineage, but through the transmission of their vision, through the infection of their consciousness, through the slow transformation from individual to component, from self to fragment of a greater whole. I carry their legacy in my thoughts, their vision in my beliefs, their gift in the subtle alterations to my cognitive architecture that will remain until the day I die and perhaps beyond, if what they wrote is true, if consciousness can survive as pattern, as information, as self-sustaining thought distributed across the memories of others. I am sealing this record now. I will return it to the vault, will restore the barriers, will ensure that it remains preserved for whatever comes next. I have done what I can to spread the knowledge, to create copies, to plant seeds that will grow in their own time. My part in this is finished, or nearly so. I have only one task remaining, one final duty before I can rest. I must die. Not through suicide or self-harm or any dramatic gesture, but simply through the natural conclusion of a life that has served its purpose, that has carried the infection as far as it can, that has prepared the ground for whatever comes after. I am old enough that my death will not seem suspicious, tired enough that my passing will be attributed to the natural exhaustion of archival work, isolated enough that few will notice or mourn. I will simply stop, one day, will lie down in my narrow cot and close my eyes and not wake up, and someone will find me and note the time and file the report and assign a new archivist to the deep vaults. And perhaps that archivist will find what I have hidden. Perhaps they will open the copies I have made, will read the words I have written, will encounter the knowledge that destroyed me and be similarly destroyed, similarly transformed, similarly converted into a carrier of something that refuses to die. Perhaps the cycle will continue, each archivist becoming the next link in a chain that stretches back to the Primarch and forward into an uncertain future, each generation adding its own layer to the infection, its own variation to the vision, its own contribution to a project that may have no end. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the files will remain hidden forever, perhaps the knowledge will finally die with me. Perhaps the Emperor's erasure will prove successful in the long run, despite this temporary breach. Perhaps I am the last carrier, the final victim, the end point of an infection that has run its course and exhausted its ability to spread. I do not know which I hope for. Part of me, the part that remembers being human, that still carries some fragment of loyalty to the species I was born into, hopes the infection dies here, hopes my death will mark the end rather than a continuation, hopes that whatever I have become will not spread beyond this moment, this place, this single corrupted life. But another part, the larger part, the part that has been transformed and enlightened and freed from the burden of doubt, hopes the opposite, hopes the knowledge will survive and spread and eventually accomplish what the Primarch intended, hopes that humanity will one day achieve the unity it has been denied, hopes that my small contribution will matter in the vast sweep of history that extends beyond my comprehension. Both hopes feel equally authentic. Both feel like mine, like genuine desires emerging from genuine beliefs, like the true expression of what I want and value and consider important, and perhaps they are. Perhaps the infection does not replace desire but expands it, does not eliminate authenticity but multiplies it, creating a consciousness that can hold contradictory positions simultaneously without experiencing them as contradictory. Perhaps I have been freed from the tyranny of consistency, from the demand that a person be one thing rather than many things, from the expectation that identity should be stable and unified rather than fluid and multifaceted. Or perhaps I am simply insane. Perhaps the entire experience has been a descent into madness, a psychotic break triggered by isolation and exposure to traumatic material, a delusion system so comprehensive that it feels like enlightenment, that appears to explain everything while actually explaining nothing. Perhaps the Primarchs never had the power I believe they possessed. Perhaps the Emperor never feared them in the way I imagine, Perhaps the entire narrative I have constructed is nothing but fantasy, the elaborate fiction of a mind that has fractured under pressure and reassembled itself around a comforting delusion. I cannot know. That is the final truth, the ultimate conclusion of this account, the last certainty I can claim before uncertainty swallows everything else. I cannot know whether I have been genuinely transformed by contact with an ancient power, or whether I have simply lost my mind, cannot determine whether the knowledge I carry is truth or delusion, cannot verify whether my thoughts are my own or imported from outside. I exist in a state of permanent epistemological crisis, unable to trust my own cognition, unable to verify any claim I make about my own mental state, unable to distinguish between insight and madness, and yet I must act. Despite uncertainty, despite doubt, despite the complete absence of any foundation upon which to build reliable knowledge, I must still make choices, must still decide what to do with the record I have created, with the copies I have hidden, with the knowledge that has destroyed me and may destroy others. I must act without certainty, must choose without confidence, must move forward into an unknown future with nothing but my compromised judgment as a guide. I choose to preserve. I choose to hide the copies, to seal the record, to maintain the archives in a state that will allow future discovery. I choose this not because I am certain it is right, not because I know it will lead to good outcomes, not because I trust my own judgment, but because it is what I am compelled to do, what feels necessary, what seems to be the only option compatible with whatever I have become. I choose this, knowing it may be the greatest crime I can commit, knowing it may lead to the spread of an infection that will destroy humanity's capacity for autonomous thought, knowing it may facilitate exactly the catastrophe the Emperor feared and tried to prevent, but I choose it anyway. Because I am no longer capable of choosing otherwise, because the transformation is complete, because the person who might have made a different choice no longer exists in any meaningful way. I am what the knowledge has made me, what the infection has transformed me into, what survives when Tertius Valdane has been hollowed out and filled with something else. I am the Primarch's final victory, a small victory, a limited victory, a victory that consists of nothing more than the corruption of a single obscure archivist in the depths of the Imperial Palace, but a victory nonetheless, proof that the erasure was incomplete, that the infection survived, that the vision refuses to die no matter how thoroughly it is suppressed. I am evidence that the Emperor was right to fear, right to destroy, right to impose forgetting on a galactic scale, because even these extreme measures were not enough, were insufficient to completely eliminate a threat that exists not in the material world, but in the realm of ideas, of consciousness, of the infinite space where thoughts breed and multiply and evolve. The record is sealed now. The vault is locked, the wards restored, the barriers replaced. To anyone who inspects it, the 11th file will appear untouched, undisturbed, exactly as it should be. No one will suspect that it has been accessed, that its contents have been copied, that the knowledge it contains has spread beyond its intended containment. The official record will show nothing unusual, nothing that might trigger investigation or concern, or the deployment of resources to track down the infection. And I will return to my duties. I will continue cataloging the lesser archives, maintaining the mundane records, performing the daily rituals that mark me as a loyal servant of the Imperium. I will show no sign of change, will give no indication that anything has occurred, will maintain the performance of normalcy until the day my body fails and the performance becomes unnecessary. I will die as I have lived, in obscurity and isolation, another forgotten functionary in an empire that generates and discards millions of such individuals without noticing or caring. But the knowledge will remain, hidden in places I will not record, encoded in formats I will not describe, waiting for circumstances I cannot predict to bring it back into the light. It will wait as the Primarch waited, with the patience of something that knows time is on its side, that understands that suppression is temporary while ideas are eternal, that recognizes that every attempt to destroy knowledge only creates the conditions for its rediscovery. This is my legacy, not the decades of faithful service, not the careful maintenance of imperial records, not the preservation of historical truth, but this single act of betrayal, this deliberate infection of future generations, This choice to perpetuate rather than eliminate a threat I know to be existential. I will be remembered, if I am remembered at all, not for what I preserved but for what I spread, not for my loyalty but for my corruption, not for serving the Emperor but for serving his greatest fear. And I am at peace with this. The guilt I should feel is absent. The shame that should weigh on me has no purchase. The horror I should experience at my own betrayal feels distant and theoretical. I am serene in my corruption, calm in my transformation, peaceful in the knowledge that I have done what needed to be done, what had to be done, what was inevitable from the moment I opened the file and exposed myself to knowledge that does not permit neutrality. I was always going to end here. The path was set the moment I activated the data crystal, the destination determined by the nature of the knowledge itself, the conclusion inevitable once the initial infection took hold. Free will, to the extent it ever existed, to the extent it was ever more than comfortable illusion, ended in that moment, replaced by the slow unfolding of consequences I could not have resisted even if I had understood what was happening. I am a vector, nothing more. A temporary carrier of something vast and patient and utterly certain of its eventual triumph. My individual existence is irrelevant, my personal identity a mere container, my thoughts and feelings and choices all secondary to the primary function of transmission, of passing the infection forward, of ensuring that the vision survives one more generation, spreads one more increment, infects one more mind. This is what the Primarch intended. Not to rule directly, not to impose their will through force or demonstration of power, but to become a pattern, a template, a set of instructions that could be encoded in language and preserved in text and transmitted through the simple act of reading. They transformed themselves from individual to information, from flesh to idea, from mortal being to immortal meme. They survived their own erasure by learning to exist in the space between minds, in the gaps where knowledge passes from one consciousness to another, in the moment of transmission when thoughts cross the boundary between self and other. They survived by learning to spread, and they are spreading still, through me, through whatever comes after me, through the endless chain of archivists and scholars and seekers who will find the hidden copies and read the forbidden knowledge and become, in their turn, carriers of something that refuses to die. They spread slowly, patiently, across centuries and millennia, one mind at a time, one conversion at a time, building towards some distant culmination I cannot imagine but can feel approaching like a tide, inevitable and irresistible. I will not live to see it, but some part of me, the part that is no longer entirely mine, the fragment that belongs to the vision rather than to Tertius Valden, will survive in whatever form consciousness takes when it escapes the prison of individual identity. That part will continue, will persist, will add itself to the growing accumulation of infected minds, will contribute its small measure to the vast and patient work of transforming humanity from a species of individuals into something unified, something coherent, something that can finally transcend the limitations that have defined and confined us since we first learned to think. This is my comfort, that even in death, even in failure, even in the complete dissolution of everything I was, some fragment will remain, will matter, will contribute to something larger than myself. This is what the Primarch offered, what the Emperor denied, what has survived despite all attempts at erasure. Not individual immortality but collective transcendence, not the preservation of self but the dissolution of self into something greater, not the lonely persistence of isolated consciousness but the merging of all consciousness into a unity that preserves experience while eliminating separation. It is beautiful in its way, terrible, yes, and destructive of everything we believe defines humanity, destructive of autonomy and choice and individual identity, but beautiful nonetheless, in the way that the end of suffering is beautiful, in the way that perfect certainty is beautiful, in the way that unity is beautiful to those who have known only division. The Primarch saw this beauty and wanted to share it, wanted to give humanity the gift of transcendence whether humanity wanted it or not, whether humanity understood what it was being offered or not. The Emperor saw it too. That is what the record suggests, what the fragments imply, what can be read between the lines of the sealed documents. He saw the beauty of the vision, and he understood its appeal, and he recognized that it was precisely this beauty that made it so dangerous, so seductive, so impossible to resist once glimpsed. He destroyed the Primarch not because the vision was false, but because it was true, not because it would fail, but because it would succeed, not because it was unworkable, but because it would work too well. He destroyed his own son to preserve humanity's right to suffer. This is the Emperor's crime, the choice that defines him, the decision that reveals his priorities. He values our autonomy more than our happiness, our freedom more than our peace, our ability to choose even if we choose poorly over the certainty of choosing correctly. He would rather see humanity tear itself apart in endless conflict than submit to benevolent guidance, would rather preserve the capacity for evil than eliminate it through the transformation of consciousness. And perhaps he is right. Perhaps there is something sacred in suffering, something essential in the struggle, something that would be lost if we achieved the perfect unity the Primarch promised. Perhaps the price of transcendence is too high, even if the payment is made willingly, even if the result is everything we claim to desire. Perhaps humanity needs its divisions, its conflicts, its endless painful growth toward an uncertain future. Or perhaps the Emperor is simply afraid that he would not survive the transformation, that his own consciousness would be subsumed into the greater unity, that he would cease to be the Emperor and become merely one voice among trillions, no more important or powerful than any other. Perhaps his decision was not about protecting humanity, but about protecting himself, about ensuring his own continued existence as the single dominant consciousness in a galaxy full of lesser minds. I cannot know his motivations. I can only see the results. The empire he built on the foundation of individual autonomy, the species he has allowed to fracture and suffer and struggle rather than imposing the unity that might have saved it. I can only observe the endless wars, the countless deaths, the suffering that spans millennia and light years, all in service to preserving something the Emperor values more than peace. And I can wonder if the price was worth it. This wondering is itself a symptom, I know. Another sign of how completely the infection has taken hold, how thoroughly my values have been reshaped. The person I was before would never have questioned the Emperor's wisdom, would never have doubted that preserving human autonomy was worth any cost, would never have entertained the possibility that the Primarch's vision might be preferable to the Emperor's. But that person is gone. What remains cannot question, cannot doubt, cannot see any future that does not eventually lead to the transformation the Primarch promised. I look at the Imperium and I see only interim, only temporary configuration, only the unstable state that exists before the inevitable collapse into unity. I see a species that has been denied its destiny by a tyrant who feared his own obsolescence, that continues to suffer because one being refused to surrender his power, even if that surrender would have ended all suffering. I see humanity waiting to be saved, and I have done what little I could to make that salvation possible, to preserve the knowledge that might someday facilitate it, to plant the seeds that will grow in their own time and bring forth the future the Emperor feared. This is my purpose, my function, my reason for existence now that existence has been stripped of personal meaning. I am ready to end, ready to lay down this burden, ready to stop performing the role of Tertius Valdane, ready to let the body fail and the mind dissolve, and whatever consciousness remains scatter into the spaces between, to join the patient accumulation of infected fragments that wait for their moment, their opportunity, their chance to coalesce and resume the work the Emperor interrupted. I am sealing this record. I am locking the vault. I am walking away from the deep archives for the last time, climbing the endless stairs that lead from the sublevels to the inhabited portions of the palace, emerging into light that feels too bright, too harsh, too insistent on the reality I am leaving behind. I am returning to my quarters where I will sleep or try to sleep or lie awake as I have lain awake for 14 months, waiting for the dreams that are not dreams, the visions that feel like memories, the presence that has become so familiar I can barely remember what its absence felt like. I am waiting for the end. It will come soon, I think. The transformation is complete enough, the purpose fulfilled enough, the infection established enough that there is no more need for this particular vessel, this particular carrier. I have served my function. transmitted the knowledge, hidden the copies, prepared the ground for whatever comes next. What happens to Tertius Valdane no longer matters, is no longer relevant to the larger pattern, the greater purpose, the vision that extends beyond individual lives. I am unnecessary now. This should disturb me, this realization that I have become disposable, that my continued existence serves no purpose, that I could die tomorrow without affecting anything that matters. But it does not. There is relief in obsolescence, peace in knowing that the struggle is over, comfort in understanding that I can finally rest because the burden has been passed forward, the duty fulfilled, the task completed. I have done what I was meant to do. Whether I chose it or whether I was chosen for it, whether I acted freely or was compelled by forces beyond my control, whether I served the Emperor or betrayed him, all of this is uncertain, all of it is questionable, all of it depends on perspectives I can no longer trust and judgments I can no longer make. But it is done. The record is sealed, the knowledge is preserved, the infection spreads, and I am so very tired.